Blood slowly dripped from John Sens's fist onto the black tile floor of the nightclub cafe, while a drunken man with a broken face lay beside an overturned table, struggling to get back up, as the war veteran stood over him with the cold stare of someone who had seen death too many times. The entire cafe had fallen silent. The only sound was the rain smashing against the windows somewhere on the outskirts of Chicago, while the terrified waitress shakily called the police. Just an hour earlier, everything had been calm. John had come into the small late-night cafe after finishing his shift at the auto repair shop where he worked. He often came there because he loved the quiet atmosphere, the old blues music, and the smell of fresh coffee. Ever since serving in Afghanistan, he barely trusted people anymore. Night after night, he woke up from nightmares filled with explosions, wounded soldiers screaming for help, and memories of death standing only feet away from him. Even years later, the war still lived inside his head. That night, he noticed Emily Carter sitting by the window with a cup of hot chocolate in her hands while reading a book and occasionally watching the rain slide down the glass. There was something peaceful about her that caught John's attention immediately. They started talking by accident after the waitress mixed up their orders, but within minutes, it felt as if they had known each other for years. Emily worked as a nurse at a local hospital, and she quickly realized that behind John's serious expression was a deeply exhausted man trying to survive his own memories. For the first time in a very long while, John actually smiled while talking to someone. He felt calm sitting next to her, as if the noise of war inside his mind had finally become quieter. But that peaceful night ended the moment the cafe door suddenly slammed open and a drunk man in a dirty leather jacket stumbled inside. His name was Mike Rogers, and nearly everyone in the neighborhood knew him as an aggressive alcoholic constantly looking for trouble. Barely able to stand, he immediately locked his eyes on Emily and walked straight toward their table with a disgusting grin on his face. He arrogantly asked her to dance, but Emily politely told him she was not interested. Mike only laughed and suddenly grabbed her arm, trying to pull her closer. Slowly, John stood up from his chair and quietly told him that she had already answered him. Mike smirked, shoved John hard in the chest, and sarcastically called him a hero who thinks he scares people. In that exact moment, something inside John snapped. The war had taught him patience, but when he saw fear appear in Emily's eyes, he stopped thinking about consequences. Mike did not even realize what happened before John's fist smashed directly into his jaw. The drunk man flew backward onto a table, breaking it beneath his body, but it did not end there. Mike tried to fight back, yet John moved with terrifying speed and precision, like a soldier thrown back into combat. Within seconds, the aggressor was lying on the floor covered in blood, while everyone inside the cafe stared at the veteran in complete shock. John stood there breathing heavily, staring at his own bloody hands, because deep down, he already knew one terrible truth. This night was about to change his life forever. By the next morning, John Sens's name was already all over the local news in Chicago, and reporters were calling him a dangerous veteran who brutally beaten a man inside a nightclub cafe. The police arrested John right outside the auto repair shop where he worked and barely gave him a chance to explain what had happened. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he remained completely calm, almost as if he had expected for years that his past would eventually catch up with him. Mike Rogers filed a lawsuit against him and demanded the harshest punishment possible, claiming that John had attacked him for no reason at all. Mike's lawyer repeatedly showed photos of his badly beaten face in court, trying to paint John as an unstable war veteran, unable to control himself after Afghanistan. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civilians, and several former soldiers who had come to support John. Emily Carter sat quietly near the front row with trembling hands, unable to believe that the man who had protected her was now facing up to 2 years in prison. Judge Margaret Hall carefully listened to every detail of the case without showing much emotion. She saw a scarred man with cold eyes sitting before her, but she also noticed that John had remained respectful and silent throughout the entire hearing. The prosecutor kept repeating that John's military combat experience made him especially dangerous and argued that his attacks could have easily killed someone. At one point, the discussion shifted toward post-traumatic stress disorder and the supposed danger veterans could pose to society. John sat there silently, with his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Deep inside, he had already started preparing himself for prison. But everything changed the moment Emily suddenly stood up and asked the judge for permission to speak. The entire courtroom fell silent. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and revealed that she had video footage from the cafe's security cameras that no one had seen before. The footage clearly showed Mike Rogers harassing her first, grabbing her arm aggressively and then shoving John before starting the fight himself. As the video played across the large courtroom screen, the atmosphere changed instantly. People began whispering to each other, while the prosecutor's confidence visibly faded. But the biggest shock came moments later. While reviewing John's military records, Judge Margaret Hall discovered classified documents and an old combat video from Afghanistan. The footage showed a younger John Sens carrying a wounded soldier across an active battlefield while explosions erupted around him and bullets tore through the air. He could have escaped alone, but instead he ran back to save his fellow soldier, risking his own life without hesitation. Without saying a word, the judge ordered the footage to be played in the courtroom. Everyone watched in stunned silence as John, bleeding heavily from his shoulder, screamed for medics while still carrying the injured soldier through smoke and gunfire. Several women in the courtroom began crying. Former military men lowered their heads in respect. John himself sat frozen in place, staring at the screen as if he had been dragged back into that terrible moment. Then suddenly, unable to hold it in anymore, he covered his face with his hands and broke down in tears right there in front of everyone. The courtroom had fallen so silent that the clicking of reporters' cameras echoed through the room. As John Sens sat with his head lowered, trying to hold back tears after the Afghanistan footage had been shown. Even the prosecutor, who only minutes earlier had called him a dangerous veteran, could no longer look him directly in the eyes. Judge Margaret Hall quietly reviewed the case files, while the atmosphere inside the courthouse in Chicago completely changed. People no longer saw John as a violent man who had beaten someone in a cafe. Before them was a soldier who had once risked his own life to save others. The combat footage showed a younger John carrying a wounded soldier across a battlefield while explosions erupted around him and bullets ripped through the air. Military medics later confirmed that the soldier had survived only because John refused to leave him behind. When the video ended, nobody in the courtroom moved for several long seconds. Mike Rogers sat nervously beside his lawyer, no longer looking confident the way he had at the beginning of the trial. Judge Hall slowly raised her eyes toward him before ordering the cafe security footage to be replayed once again. This time, every person in the courtroom watched carefully as the video clearly showed Mike harassing Emily Carter first, grabbing her aggressively, shoving John, and provoking the fight. Mike's lawyer tried to object, but his arguments now sounded weak and desperate. Judge Hall calmly stated that every citizen has the legal right to defend another person when they are facing immediate danger, and John's actions had clearly been an act of protection. A wave of whispers spread across the courtroom. John slowly lifted his head, almost unable to believe what he was hearing. But the real shock came only moments later. Judge Margaret Hall officially declared that war veteran John Sens was found not guilty due to self-defense and the protection of a civilian woman. The moment those words left her mouth, Emily covered her face with both hands and burst into tears of relief, while several people inside the courtroom even began applauding. Mike Rogers suddenly jumped to his feet and started yelling that the decision was unfair, but Judge Hall immediately slammed her gavel down and ordered him to remain silent. Then she announced an additional ruling. For harassment, provoking violence, and giving false testimony, Mike Rogers would be fined $10,000. The color instantly drained from his face because he had never imagined the case would turn against him. Reporters rushed out of the courtroom to spread the shocking news, while several people approached John to shake his hand. One elderly U.S. Army veteran even told him that men like him did not belong in prison because people like John were the reason the country still stood strong. But the moment that truly broke John emotionally came seconds later. A man wearing a military uniform slowly approached him through the crowd. At first, John did not recognize him. Then the man stopped directly in front of him, his eyes already filled with tears. It was the same soldier John had carried out of the battlefield years earlier. Without saying a word, the soldier pulled John into a tight embrace right there in the middle of the courtroom. And once again, the entire room fell completely silent. The hallways of the courthouse in Chicago were still filled with the noise of reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing everywhere. But John Sens barely heard any of it. After the verdict, he sat alone on a wooden bench near the wall, staring silently at the floor while people around him discussed the shocking trial. His hands trembled slightly, and deep inside his mind, the sounds of Afghanistan still echoed like they had never truly ended. Emily Carter slowly walked toward him and quietly sat beside him without saying a word at first. For several long seconds, they both remained silent until she gently took his hand. "You saved me that night, John," she whispered softly, while trying not to cry. "If you hadn't been there, I don't even want to imagine what could have happened." John lowered his eyes and let out a heavy breath. "I'm not a hero, Emily," he said quietly. "The real heroes never came home." Emily immediately shook her head and looked directly into his eyes. "No, John, a hero is someone who still protects people even after the world gives him every reason to stop caring." John looked away because he did not know how to answer her. Ever since returning from war, he had spent years believing society had forgotten people like him. But for the first time in a long while, someone was looking at him not as a broken veteran, but as a human being. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the hallway as a man in military uniform approached them. It was Alex Morgan, the same soldier John had once carried across the battlefield under enemy fire. Alex stopped in front of him for a few seconds, his eyes filled with emotion, before suddenly pulling John into a tight embrace. "You idiot," Alex said with a shaking voice. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone how much pain you were carrying?" John struggled to hold back tears. "Because after war, everyone expects you to move on like nothing ever happened," he answered quietly. Alex stepped back and stared directly at him. "That day in Afghanistan, you saved my life. I still remember you carrying me through explosions while screaming for the medics not to let me die. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't even be standing here today." John wiped his eyes with his sleeve and forced a nervous smile. "I just couldn't leave you there." Suddenly, one of the reporters pushed through the crowd and shouted loudly, "John, how does it feel to be proven innocent?" Every camera instantly turned toward him. John slowly stood up from the bench and looked around at the reporters before remaining silent for several seconds. "You know," he finally began quietly, "the worst part about war isn't the bullets or the explosions." The hallway became completely silent. "The worst part is coming home and slowly starting to believe that nobody needs you anymore." Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment. "I never wanted to hurt anyone that night." John continued, "I just saw a frightened woman, and in that moment, I did the only thing I've done my entire life. I protected the person standing next to me." Emily stood beside him with tears running down her face, while Alex silently nodded in respect. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Margaret Hall herself walked toward John through the crowd. She stopped directly in front of him and looked at him carefully for several seconds before speaking. "Mr. Sens," she said calmly, "today, this court officially declared you innocent. But honestly, I think you deserved justice long before you ever walked into this courtroom." John did not answer. He simply turned his head toward the large courthouse windows, where the rain had finally stopped and sunlight slowly began breaking through the dark clouds over the city skyline.